We are just minutes away from President Biden convening a virtual summit focused on democracy. The two-day event includes leaders from more than 100 participating countries and comes as the Biden administration attempts to push back against the growing influence of both Russia and China. Mr. Biden will also speak with Ukrainian President Zelensky today after holding a call with Russia's Vladimir Putin earlier this week. On that call, the president warned Russia against invading Ukraine as Moscow amasses troops at the border between the two countries. So Christina Ruffini is joining us now with more on all of this. Christina, it's been a while since I had an opportunity to talk to you, and I always appreciate the insight and context that you bring us. So let us start with this summit. It fulfills a campaign pledge by President Biden. Can you tell us more about why and how this summit came together?
It does. I mean, I think it was Politico referred to this as the Zoom call to save democracy, right? President Biden has made a big emphasis on the fact that authoritarianism around the world is on the rise. And there's data to back that up. We're seeing a shift towards authoritarianism in a lot of countries that just a few years ago looked like they were on the path to being progressive, functional democracies. So the president and the White House says it wants to get all these countries together. Some we would, categorize as full-fledged flourishing democracies. Some are transitional democracies. Some, but he wants to get these countries together and talk about, Western democratic values, talk about human rights, talk about freedom of the press, and what nations can do to try to foster a better environment for democracy around the world. Now, that all sounds great, but really there's another goal of this, and that is to push back against illiberal democracies, and we're looking at countries like China and Russia, who are both very upset about this summit. They weren't invited. China was so upset it commissioned a big paper that basically said that China's one-party system is a superior form of democracy to the United States. So this is a goal of President Biden's to talk about democracy, to get countries looking at themselves, looking at where they're failing, where they can do better. But it's also a way to rally countries that see the world the same way the United States does, get them all together and send a very strong message to countries like Russia and China that the Western countries are trying to get together and keep the international norms in the lens of the United States.
So, as you mentioned, some countries were not invited, and they're none too happy about it. China and Russia, two of them. I'm wondering if there are others, and just how the White House went about choosing who to send an invite to.
Yeah, there are some others. China and Russia. I guess if you're looking at this from a U.S. perspective, like I said, it makes sense because they're trying to send a message. But there are some other choices that are a little confusing. There have been some countries that have, sketchy democratic values. I don't want to say that. A democratic record, according to international observers. Brazil is there. Bolsonaro has come under a lot of criticism. The Philippines has been invited. President Duterte has a very suspect human rights record there, whereas countries like Hungary were not invited. They're in the European Union. They're very upset about that. They tried to lobby other EU members to boycott the summit. And the Northern Triangle countries were not invited. Guatemala, Ecuador. These are countries that the U.S. has had a lot of diplomatic dealings with. They do have issues with their democracy. They are struggling in some cases to get those governments to function the way their people need them. But, the U.S. in the last administration, their goal had been kind of to reach out to them and try to foster those democracies. So there's a lot of pushback about, these are countries you're trying to get on board. These are countries you're trying to help to stem your own migration crisis. Why wouldn't you invite them to a summit like this to try to bring them into the fold a little bit and include them and, in a way, help them, if this is the goal of the summit, to help foster democracy? Why wouldn't you bring aspirational countries into that? And why would you exclude others? It's guest lists in Washington are always a bit touchy, and this one is no exception.
Right. So in the meantime, the president is also going to speak with the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky. It's sort of curious because it's, a couple days after he had that video phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. But as I understand it, he's spoken before with Zelensky and has a good, thorough understanding of Zelensky's concerns and desires. What do we expect the two to talk about? I guess that's pretty obvious. But also, what is it that the U.S. can offer Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression? I know in the past they have bolstered Ukraine's defenses, if you will. And I wonder if there's anything more, though, that the U.S. is willing to offer.
So that's really what they're probably going to discuss. I mean, I think both sides at this point know where Russia is. They're seeing this troop buildup. They know where this trajectory could be going. But the issue is, like you said, what is the U.S. and what is the EU? What are these countries prepared to do about it? Because, you know, Ukraine is not in NATO. And a couple years ago, most Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO. That number has really risen over the past couple years. I think now it's almost at like 40%. So that's a big fear for Vladimir Putin, right? And so this is part of the reason that this conflict is happening, is he sees NATO encroaching on what he sees as Russia's traditional territory. The Ukrainians have been making a big push to have the EU, to have NATO think of them as their own. When the Ukrainian defense minister was here, he gave all of his statements in English. Normally, the foreign ministers, when they come here, they speak in the language of their country because their audience is their people back home. It was very clear his audience was us. It was the US, it was Europe. He was saying the best way to protect Ukraine is to make it permanently and undeniably a part of the West, to make it part of Europe, to, you know, he's saying they've chosen their team and they want to be on the team. Let us in the club. The problem with that is NATO is a mutual defense pact, right? They have this Article 5. If you hit one of us, you hit all of us. We got to go to bat for you. So by joining NATO, it would essentially be a liability, and every other European country that's in NATO would be forced by that charter to take action if Russia invades. And there's not a lot of appetite for a full-scale conflict with Moscow. So what the U.S. can promise, it's not really clear, right? They've said they're going to still keep sending them weapons. They sent another shipment of mostly small arms this week. But if Russia actually starts expanding its efforts and looking like it's going to invade, the question really remains, what will the U.S., what will Europe do about it? And I'm sure that is what the subject of that call is going to focus on.
Yeah, and I presume also, he's going to be set to talk with the Bucharest Nine, which are a group of countries on the eastern edge of NATO. I presume that is also going to be number one topic on that when it comes to that conversation as well. It certainly seems like Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is sort of a red line for both sides that, as you sort of point out, neither side really wants to cross or broach.
No, and look, the U.S. has been very upfront saying it wants to support Ukrainian, territorial integrity. It's not good for Europe if Russia starts expanding into Europe further than its borders. But at the same time, there isn't a lot of appetite for a ground war in Europe. The good news, if you want to phrase it that way, is there's not a lot of appetite for an actual ground war in Russia either, right? You know, President Putin is fairly popular. He's not as popular as he once was. This kind of bravado and these threats do increase his look on the international stage. It does play well at home. But what's not going to play well at home, I've heard several Russian commentators talk about this week, is if Russian soldiers start coming home in body bags, right? The Russian people don't want to lose their soldiers any more than the Europeans do either. And there's not a huge appetite. You know, Russia has a lot of other problems. They don't really need a war right now. So hopefully those two forces and the lack of desire to start another conflict will help settle this out. The problem is, how are they going to settle it? You know, the U.S. has been talking to Ukraine about maybe ceding some sort of territorial autonomy to this Donbass region in the east where Russia has been kind of occupying. That gets tricky because then are you threatening Ukraine's territorial integrity at the same time? You've got to give the Russians something so that they can feel like they've won something and can go back to their people. And then maybe they can, cooler heads will prevail and everybody can step back and we can take a breath and we can look at, Ukraine maybe joining NATO at the end of the decade or something like that seems to be the timeline. So we'll have to see. But it's a very real threat, and sorry, go ahead, Amory.
Sorry, I was going to say that you make a good point that earlier in the week when we were talking about Ukraine, it's saying that when Russia initially invaded Crimea, Ukraine really didn't have much of a standing army. There was only, a few thousand, poorly equipped, didn't really have uniforms, weren't really prepared. That is not the Ukraine of today. And so what Vladimir Putin may be looking at is something that could very quickly, if he was to sort of make inroads in Ukraine, could very quickly spiral into a very unpopular military action.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a real conflict. The thing is, you're right, they are better equipped, they are better trained. They are not, however, a threat to Russia. And that's kind of the flaw in Putin's argument. He's saying, well, Ukraine is making threats towards us, and he's, like you said, NATO. Any NATO troops in Ukraine will be a red line for Russia. We're going to have to take action. Ukraine is not a military threat to Russia, even in its current state. It's just not. So the idea that they could somehow pose a threat to Putin is not really realistic. It's more of he's looking for a reason. He's looking for justification to expand and to invade. Maybe not invade, but to take action in that region. So it's just not a valid argument. Now, if NATO does decide to back Ukraine, that's a different argument. But that's also, again, back to our previous point, that's a much larger conflict that I don't think anybody, including Russia, really wants.
Yeah, indeed. Christina Ruffini, thank you very much.
So nice to see you. Thank you.